Hello, everyone. Welcome back. We have Chris Georgen on the show, founder of Topple and managing director. Chris, thanks for being here today.
Thanks for having me, Steph. Excited for the conversation.
So, in my research, I found it really interesting and always need to touch on the philosophy topics. So, I saw that your background, you have a degree in mathematics, chemical physics, and philosophy. Those are some heavy subjects, but the philosophy one stands out to me because of how Topple is aligning itself with sustainability, impact, inequity in mind, and and just to kind of touch on that, I was wondering if you could link the genesis of the ideas that led to Topple in a key moment or resource in your philosophy education.
Where a lot of this came from for me is as we were studying some history of philosophy and some specifically some history of ethics and kind of just different schools of thoughts that have risen and fallen over the years. It really it clicked for me how important it was the systems that exist, in that the systems we choose to create, the systems that we choose to participate in, are very oftentimes like a reflection of what we want our underlying values to be. And really that way that, again, we create those systems from some ideal or something like that, and that those systems then really do have a big effect on the ethical decisions we make, the moral judgments we make, and just like we live in those systems. And where this came from for me is I saw blockchain as an opportunity to like remake some scaffolding, kind of remake or reimagine the way that people interact with each other, the way we engage with each other. And we started Topple trying to answer the question of, what if we tried to make impact, and sustainability more core to our economic interactions, and try to say that, hey, you really can't do, or you really shouldn't be doing one without the other. So right now, from a perspective that we, hold today in 2023, there's always like this trade-off that you always, you're trying to make the most money you can, subject to the constraint of not being an absolutely terrible person for other people, or for the environment. But one is always treated as a constraint to the other, and they are never viewed as being able to be like simultaneously maximized. And that's what we were trying to overturn, I guess.
Yeah, it's can you build in natively into a protocol the ability to do those things and not be restricted by the legacy decisions of decades or centuries?
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
So I love that, and that seems to be kind of. I mean, it is core within yourself and your team. I've spoken with several of your team members, James Amon, CTO, and Aaron Schuster, the director of research, and both of them, you could hear it kind of just kind of ooze out that mission, and so it's that's very interesting to me in terms of building a protocol and building a team. Um,
Mhm.
how to instill those kinds of values. I will touch on that. I want to get back to team building, but I still kind of want to dig into your background a bit.
Mhm.
So I think you got into the blockchain space in 2012, or at least started paying attention, and
Yes.
that is almost radically early. And so, what would you say? Kind of what was, I mean, did you initially read or see the Bitcoin white paper and have a light bulb moment? Did it take time? What was the thing that kind of, how did that come about? Where did your conviction develop?
So I'd say, being honest, the conviction was slow coming. It, started out very much as, playing around with it. I had some friends and, some people that I had met from like some economics classes I were taking that were, pretty into Bitcoin. They were they were gold bugs, so to speak, meaning the type of people that think gold is the right type of money and we need to go back to gold. And, Bitcoin in a lot of ways is a digital version of that. So I had some friends that introduced me to it. I had always, or at least for a while, been interested in playing around with different like fintechs and different financial technologies. Actually, the first startup that I did in the blockchain space was a bit of a fintech in its own right. So I really loved the application of, new technologies to rethinking payments, rethinking money transfers, all those things. And Bitcoin aligned well with that. But the first project that I actually really started experimenting with and kind of really dove in on was, oddly enough, Ripple. Ripple and XRP. So back when I discovered that project, I think this probably would have been around 2013, so a couple months into my journey. Ripple was doing this really interesting thing, marrying some of my science background. They had virtual mining for XRP. So they had partnered with like the Berkeley Grid Computing Project, SETI at Home, Folding at Home, all of those tools that some of us might be familiar with, where we can donate our compute resources to helping solve these big scientific problems. And what they were doing is they would say, if you're running this on your computer, we will airdrop you some XRP. So, basically by contributing to scientific computing, you were able to actually mine this crypto. And I thought that was amazing. I thought this was innovative. I thought it was absolutely fascinating. This marriage of new economic experimentation with scientific or mathematical advancement. And that was actually an area of the space that completely captivated me for a while. There was another project that I played around with, experimented with for a while, actually called Primecoin as well, where there was this problem, and to some extent this problem still exists, that people consider the all the energy resources going into mining as like wasted, right? We're not actually solving an interesting math problem. It's something incredibly, incredibly simple. You just have to do it to a crazy precision. Primecoin came around trying to solve that problem. So it was still proof of work, but the work that you were doing was you were searching for twin primes. They have some applications in advanced cryptography and things like that. And it was a relatively short lived project, but just, again, absolutely fascinating. Just kind of, I think, a really cool example of some of the experimentation that we got in the space, 8, 9 years ago at this point.
So at least some tinkerer mindset, some entrepreneurial mindset, some technically focused mindset. All these things led you to at least begin experimenting, and that would lead you to your first startup, and then to topple afterwards.
Yes.
Okay, so that before we kind of dive into topple, I noticed that you did research in complex systems, or at least some emergence of complex systems. In what field of study was that in? And then could we just talk a little bit about that, because I'm complex system is dear to me, and so I'll just have the opportunity now. Why not ask?
So 4 years when I was at university, I spent time in a research lab that kind of sat at the intersection of material science and a field of physics known as condensed matter physics. And it was an experimental lab primarily, so we were searching for and synthesizing new compounds that might be high temperature superconductors or would exhibit, interesting magnetic properties or interesting semiconductor properties. And again, a lot of it was, tinkering with the underlying materials. We had furnaces, we had all sorts of experimental apparatus. But what I got involved in about halfway through my time with the group was I took over our computational work, because what we would oftentimes do is when we would synthesize a new material and we would characterize its properties, we would begin the analysis of the why behind, why does this material exhibit these sorts of properties? And so that sort of like computational material science or computational condensed matter physics is what I got involved in. And what fascinated me and what kind of makes it, really the study of emergent principles is all of those properties come from a lot of very, very simple interactions. So, it's just the number of electrons or the spin of different electrons, or, just kind of relatively simple distributions acting at like just absolutely massive, massive scales. And so you end up with properties that you can only see, that will only ever emerge like in an emergent manner. And really, where that then dovetailed into my research in economics and ultimately kind of the creation of Topple was like we as economic agents, we as individuals interacting with each other are very much the same way. That when you zoom out and you try to do macroeconomic modeling or anything like that, it looks so different and it looks wholly divorced from like the individual buying and selling decisions that any individual person might make. And that's, for me, that was really kind of the through line. But no, material science and condensed matter physics is where I started kind of that type of research and that sort of computational methods approach.
So that's fascinating. I'm starting from the opposite end, which is economics and macroeconomics, and have, I think, identified the that there are emergent phenomena in this world, and I'm going back down into
Hmm.
smaller and smaller scales. So, dissipative structures and Ilioprigogene, I think was involved in defining what that term was, um, and and so the scale invariance of
Yeah.
emergent phenomena seems to apply. It is scale invariant. There is emergent phenomena at all levels, and I would put blockchain technology and the like here at the edge of economic development as a here's a new dissipative structure. And so that's
Yes.
where I'm at.
Yeah. No, totally. And I mean, it's so fascinating, right? And I mean, the economics approach just makes it even more complex. And one of the big areas of economics I found myself started getting really interested in is behavioral economics. And so, at least when I was dealing with these physics systems, at least the micro was super simple. Like we knew what an electron did, and we were confident in that. And then things just got really, really messy as we scaled it. Well, behavioral economics comes along and says that, like, hey, your assumptions about even the way that individuals act actually isn't even correct. So everything that you're building on top of that, we need to retest that, recognizing that people aren't always rational, that there are these like little quirks to our economic activities that like we need to be better about considering. And I've always thought that was a fascinating subfield of econ.
100% agree. And there's so much error built into the human that so developing a protocol to allow humans to build on top of it. I mean, there's so much to take into account, but you would say, or you would try and find those simple primitives that allow you to have that emergent
Yeah,
complex phenomena.
yeah,
And
exactly.
so that's what we're doing at Topple. That's what we're attempting to do. I would say as well, if to do that and have a moral or a ethical point of view on it, how does that add complexity or does it not? How are you thinking about that?
No, it definitely adds complexity. And well, let's see if we can center the conversation back along a single axis. Because, sometimes people will come to us and say, like, hey, morals or ethics, well, that's outside of the purview of what we should be investing in, or you're not going to be able to get buy-in with that unless people like ideologically agree with you. And, usually you just don't want to do too much business with those people, but sometimes you have to grant the point. The other way of approaching it, but still we have to deal with a lot of complexity. But even there, sometimes it's easier to look at the complexity if we make this shift. What if we just said, instead of doing this because it's ethically right, what if we just said we need to make systems in this way simply so that they survive? In that, if you want to be able to profit over the next 500 years, the earth still needs to be around to support human life. If you want people to come into work every day and keep working for you and keep buying goods, well, if we keep, income inequality growing so much to the fact that there's popular upheaval, well, that's not exactly good for day to day business. So, if instead of just saying, hey, there's a moral element or an ethical element that you may or may not agree with, what if we just reminded everyone that in order for any of this stuff that we're doing to even keep existing, like we just have to find a whole different balance. And what we're doing right now just isn't sustainable, isn't, viable going forward. And so we almost think of it from the perspective of, all right, we're doing things in the short term, but those things in the short term need to align with or be coherent with viability over the really long term. That's one way of thinking about it, but yes, still a lot of complexity to build across that time axis, I guess.
Got it. Great. And I mean, that's worthwhile for the reframing. It's just, it doesn't necessarily mean that there is an opinion here. It just means that this thing, if it needs to be robust and needs to align and it needs to serve in a particular direction as well, it needs to
Yeah.
have those built into it. Okay, so all right, I got to ask my question about complex systems. That's a goal of mine. I'm very happy with that. We can go a couple ways here. There's a quote that I believe you said that you can fact check me on that or not, but the quote was, recognize that good intentions aren't everything. Just because you're trying to have a positive impact doesn't mean you won't accidentally make things worse. Many social and environmental problems are complex. As social entrepreneurs, we need to recognize that sometimes we may lack local or on the ground insights essential to seeing the whole picture. With that quote, which is just brilliant, how are you thinking about local or on the ground insights when defining a protocol system?
Yeah. So in a lot of ways, and I think where that quote comes from and where that, thinking in Topple comes from is like, so if anyone's familiar with the refi space, there is like just this absolute Cambrian explosion right now of interest, people, technologists, people in Web3 saying like, hey, we're going to start solving some of these problems. We're going to completely reimagine carbon markets, or we're going to completely reimagine X. But one of the problems is these markets, they'll already exist. There's complexities in in these different areas that sometimes coming from the purely technologist or purely startup Web3 approach, we might be missing, and we might run into obstacles that those who are already in the space or those that have on the ground experience could have actually pointed out for us in advance. And the way that that affects our thinking is, well, the first thing that it affected us doing is we took a bit of a different approach when we were building out our protocol. So, not only I've been in the blockchain space going all the way back, 2012, 2013, and Topo actually got its start when ICOs were still happening, when people were still doing initial coin offerings. So we had that as a potential route on the table for us. We could launch the token, launch the first version of the protocol right away, and just kind of get right out of the gate. The reason that we passed on that option really went down to the fact that we didn't think we knew enough yet, and that everything that we had been building, every decision that we had made, was just our best guess. And once you go through decentralization, once you go through your token event, protocols start to calcify. It becomes kind of difficult to make big changes, as anyone familiar with chain or even DeFi governance can attest to. These votes are really challenging, and big changes for these public listed projects, they're tricky to navigate. There's been like some absolutely amazing interviews that people in the Cosmos ecosystem have actually given on their big Stargate update when they finally introduced IBC, their like inter-blockchain messaging protocol. It was like this massive coordination problem to like get this update through, and we knew we wanted to avoid challenges like that, and so we made sure to take the time to run a number of what we refer to as reference customer programs or reference user programs. So this is where we bring in maybe half a dozen or a dozen different organizations at a time that are actually their supply chain or commodities actors, or these are like on the ground in the global south impact and sustainability groups. And we will go through actually processes of co-development with them, where we say, we're going to bring in this new feature into the chain, or we're going to build this application together. And we actually, will lengthen it out 6 months, a year, sometimes maybe even longer, and say, let's do co-development actually with these organizations. Because, we have very interesting ideas, but those ideas definitely need to be fact checked, so to speak.
Yeah, so that is getting on the ground, and I see where it comes from. So I love the intentional. That's what I'm hearing is you're taking the intentional approach, which I mean, it's tough to be that intentional as so much change occurs here. You're seeing new ideas play out, and well, some of these work, some don't. But that one intentional decision to not move forward in the ICO phase where you want to be accurate to what you're capable of offering is just, I think, something worth celebrating. And I think it goes back into like why the why that you're coming here with is greater than the business opportunity that you're coming here with. So I just want to highlight that. It's well done.
Yeah, appreciate that. And yeah, I will definitely say for anyone considering an entrepreneurial journey, that why is super important because there are, really tough days in any startup's life. And sometimes you really need to fall back to the why because in the short run, it doesn't always seem worth it until you remind yourself of the reason and then you keep powering through.
So let's talk about a little bit more on the day to day or the things that you're currently working on as managing director. James Amon, CTO, said to me that we're designing a 10-year blockchain and 1,000-year blockchain. What does that look like on a daily basis from your point of view? What are the things that you're working on?
Yeah, so from a daily basis, there's first and foremost, there is a lot of coordination and collaboration between James and myself as we are constantly testing, constantly beating up, new feature ideas, new product ideas, and figuring out how we can, sort into those two buckets that James actually identifies of, all right, we've got a running list of what's going in the short-term version of the protocol, and then we've got a running list of things that we need to be aware of so that we can build to them in the future because there is this this problem in when you're building a system that yes can upgrade over time but is still meant to be able to be at least somewhat backward compatible. Even if you're not going to implement a feature today, you still have to make certain decisions so that you are compatible with that in the future. So there's a lot of that road mapping done between James and I do spend a lot of time as well with with those reference users that I talked about as we go around and we are looking to stand up or explore new verticals. There's a lot of time either done on site for us or on site with partners where we'll just spend a day or a couple days whiteboarding out and mapping out use cases so people can actually get started and start bringing that to the protocol. I do lead our tokenomics and our governance work, and that's a I'd say a pretty big focus for us this year because as we did delay doing our ICO, TGE, all that decentralization stuff in 2017, 2018, 2023 is finally going to be the year that we go through that process and we really start the transformation of Topple from like this, singularly incorporated, tech startup entity into this entire ecosystem of interrelated companies, open source, all of those things. So a lot of legal work, a lot of governance and tokenomic work that goes into that.
The tokenomics and governance work is really fascinating. What are the main questions that you're asking yourselves there?
Yeah, I'd say there's two big things that we're wrestling with that we're really trying to be aware of right now. One is this, and sometimes you get some advantages by not going first, and you get to see what pitfalls other groups fall into. But we're really looking, I'd say, very closely at governance involvement and really trying to figure out ways to, when we do transition over to token-based, more decentralized governance, like how do you actually make sure the community is involved? How do you actually get buy-in, and how do you, properly say, hey, we've given the community this possibility. What decisions are we able to make to kind of help make sure that opportunity is actually taken advantage of? Going in line with that, we're also spending a lot of time trying to solve this kind of this plutocracy, both problem and plutocracy perception that that blockchains have, that DeFi has, that proof of stake blockchains have. In that, when we think about governance in general, we think one person, one vote. It's very much not the case in blockchain systems because identity is still an open challenge. So we tie, the amount of governance rights that someone has to the amount of capital that they've put in the system. And because, they're new types of systems, because they are doing a lot of things like purely in an economic realm, some people say that makes sense. We think that's still way too far. So, trying to answer the question of how can we make, even blockchain governance more egalitarian, more inclusive? That's one area that we're spending a lot of time on. The other area that we're spending a lot of time on, and big questions we're trying to answer, is how can we talk a lot about sustainability from the projects that we're trying to help, both environmental sustainability, but there's this big problem actually in the impact or the development space more broadly, that organizations are trying to get out of the grant cycle. They're saying that, hey, every year, if we want to do a new project, we have to get a new grant, and then we're going to do that project and get a new grant. None of that is like economically self-reinforcing. There's no economic flywheel there. And people in the development and impact space are trying to get out of that. We've taken some of that thinking to say, how can we make sure that our tokenomics are also being used to help grow the ecosystem, make sure the ecosystem is able to advance over time? Because we don't basically just want to say, hey, we're going to raise a bunch of money in the token sale, and then we need to like coast off of that into perpetuity, because we want the ecosystem to grow. We want the ecosystem to become more and more vibrant over time. And we think that you can hopefully design tokenomics in such a way that helps to that end.
Mm-hmm. At some point you are just releasing it, then, have the incentives been designed in a way that bring community in, that they can accelerate their own projects, that they have the support to build and then launch and be sustainable on top of as applications. I assume you consider yourself lucky, though in the day-to-day it can be stressful. What's something that keeps you sane? Mission, obviously. What's something on a daily basis that you look forward to in this space?
So one of the things that I think you almost have to love in the blockchain space is you have to love teaching, you have to love having conversations with people, kind of like evangelizing. And because, the space is still relatively nascent. Yes, a lot of people have heard of it, but it's still a pretty small group. I always draw a lot of energy, a lot of excitement, a lot of joy when I get to come in and teach a class at a university, or spend some time trying to convince people of something at a meetup, or trying to introduce someone into the space, because I think in a lot of ways the blockchain space, like a lot of new spaces, always runs a risk of becoming an echo chamber or becoming a bit insular. And so when I see that community growing, or when I have an opportunity to help that community grow or help evangelize people, I absolutely love that. And like I said, get a lot of energy and excitement out of that.
It's the fun part. It's tough too, because a lot of people bring their preconceived ideas to it, and so then you have to back out what you think we really should be focused on, and then try and build from those fundamentals. So what do you think are things that two groups, business leaders that you speak to, or and however you define that, and friends and family that you don't, that is still a large misconception? Could you identify something in both those demographics?
Yeah, so I'd actually say there's a lot of crossover and just some pretty universal misconceptions that still exist. On kind of the business side, and some of like larger industry players and things like that, there's misconceptions around like privacy and blockchain. So people get presented with like cryptocurrencies or everything being public on the Ethereum blockchain, and they get kind of worried that like, oh, it needs to be that way, so that if I bring my organization into blockchain just a little bit, I now have to start doing things and buying and selling Bitcoin and Ether, and like all of my data is now going to be public. We don't talk about enough just as a space, or we haven't been good enough about educating around the fact that like there are privacy preserving techniques in the blockchain space that organizations can use. And that, yes, if you want to bring like financial assets and things like that into the blockchain space, they become like crypto assets because they're on a blockchain. That doesn't mean that like your bond portfolio that you are now using for blockchain technology all turned into cryptocurrencies that Coinbase is going to list next week. So that like everything is a cryptocurrency, and that like privacy consideration are, I think, kind of two big misconceptions that still exist among a lot of corporates. Then the other big area, from a friends and family perspective, is, I don't know, we're like 5 years or 5 or 6 years into viable proof of stake blockchains, and there's still such a heavy energy thought that runs through a lot of people's head. Still so much the thought that everything is like Bitcoin, everything is like very, very energy intensive. So that environmental narrative that the Bitcoin had kind of bled out to the rest of the Web3 space, I would still say is pretty prevalent.
Yeah, agreed. Do you think you could steelman of sorts Bitcoin's energy use in any particular way? Do you see that positive at all? Or is it seriously just a waste and we can do the same exact thing or something that gets us to the same outcome but without doing that?
So there's two ways that I think about that. One is sometimes people will make an argument that proof of stake is like more economically centralizing than proof of work is, because in proof of stake, I own the token, I'm getting the fees, and kind of my share is able to grow. And then people will try to make the argument that in a proof of work system, that's not the case, because there's an intermediate step of that. I have mining power, I earn Bitcoin, but then to get even more Bitcoin, I have to buy more mining equipment. Personally, I've never really bought that argument of just like there being an extra step. So I don't think there's really much to say in terms of like one is more or less economically centralizing than the other. The most compelling arguments that I've seen probably go a bit above my pay grade, so to speak, in terms of like how the energy grid works and things like that. Actually, Lee Bratcher, who does a lot of policy and advocacy work here in Texas, he runs the Texas blockchain. It's TBC, so it's either Texas Blockchain Commission or Texas Blockchain Council. But they do a lot of work looking at how Bitcoin mining can be used as an early incentive for like new renewable energy development, or how it can be used as kind of like a load balancer on the grid. I'm definitely not an energy specialist in that sense, but those are probably the most compelling arguments that I've seen. Though I have also seen some projects actually in Iceland. So an early part of my crypto career was actually spent in the Netherlands, so I got some exposure to the European ecosystem as well, and I'm familiar with some efforts where they were trying to move Bitcoin mining to Iceland, power it on geothermal energy, which is there anyway, and it's in excess, and then actually use the residual heat that comes out of all this mining equipment to like power greenhouses and things like that. So I thought that was a pretty cool, relatively circular model. Don't know how far it ever got, but I do remember some people from when I was over there that they were working on that.
Agree with the kind of exploiting new energy sources, or being a first mover there. I was always, I think, fascinated by the idea that during the rainy season in southeastern China, there would be an excess of mining power, or excess of mining coming from there. But I'd previously worked at Tesla and their energy team and kind of studied the electrical grid, and it's the most fun idea that I have that around Bitcoin is just to play with how is energy related to money, and then is there this is a question that's going to lead into the kind of the inequity thing, and climate crisis. The question is, in developing countries, those that don't have excess energy capacity like we might, we it would be disgenuine to try to limit the amount of energy production in those developing nations.
Mm-hmm.
And so um, I think one of the arguments against Bitcoin is like, well, that's just using wasteful energy. It doesn't make any sense. Plus, we have this climate crisis, and we need to limit energy production anyway. Do you see that as, um, I'm not sure this is a great question, but do you see that as, how do you see the inequity in
Yeah.
energy usage across the globe?
No, it's a great question. So I'll actually kind of harken back to the quote of mine that you shared earlier. Oftentimes, that context that's missing, or one of the big areas where we see context missing, is actually even between those focused on economic development and those focused on, climate change mitigation. Is one of the big schools of thought on, on that climate side, as you're alluding to, is to say, oh, we have to like limit economic growth, or you can't do this type of thing, even though this type of thing, like this sort of fast industrialization, is exactly how the West and the global North, made all its money. And now we're like on the other side of that barrier, and we're saying, no, 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 you can't do that. Well, even though we did it, 50, 100 years, to some extent, are still doing it. So I'd say that's really, a massive problem in how do we align the conversations around climate sustainability with conversations around economic growth, economic advancement. And this is, I haven't really found anyone that has the right answer to that question. And it is why, though, that we are trying to go through this mindset shift of saying, can we make those better behaviors, those more sustainable behaviors, those more ethical behaviors, can we also make those behaviors the ones that are the most profitable, the most economically sustainable, to kind of escape that trap, so to speak. But no, it is, it's a big problem. And I think it's a problem that unfortunately can sometimes be exacerbated by the fact that so many of these conversations to date, like, happen in the forum of the UN that like has very specific politics, very specific kind of voting dynamics and voting blocks in terms of global North countries, global South countries, and everything like that. That, maybe those sort of constraints or, voting problems don't exist if we kind of just move it to be more community based. That's the hope, at least.
Yeah, well said. I think we still largely have to see the promise of those things play out in blockchain ecosystems, but that promise is large enough for us to place substantial bets here in time,
Yeah.
in energy, in team building, in development. And so where do you see kind of things catching fire first, from a Topple point of view?
Yeah, so to speak kind of to some of Tupple's ecosystem development to date, the first area that we really started getting involved in and started getting good traction in was the supply chain side. So we've done a lot of work and continue to do a lot of work with ethical supply chains or more sustainable supply chains. So, everything conflict-free diamonds, sustainable timber, fair wage agriculture, because what we stumbled upon, what we realized with supply chains, is supply chains didn't have a bootstrapping problem. So many blockchain applications, use cases, they're all marketplace based. They're two-sided marketplaces, buyer and seller, or sometimes they're even more than two-sided marketplaces. And so if like one player or just a few people are coming into that, you can't really get value out of it. That's why liquidity farming is such a big deal, because you have to get people in before there's value for them to have. Supply chains never had that problem and still don't have that problem, because since you're delivering transparency, since you're delivering immutability, all those great things that blockchain does, you can actually like do that one supply chain at a time. So when we went around selling our blockchain to these groups, it didn't matter if anyone else was using it, because the value was there for them, even if they were just using it on their own. So we found that fun little hack to at least get started. But from there, and where we're, I think, really starting to see acceleration is we're seeing a lot of demand on the carbon side, actually. There's really a proliferation of new carbon exchanges, new carbon standards, just a lot of innovation that's happening in that space because the way that carbon markets work today, it's a little bit, it's not quite a monopoly, but it's pretty close in that you have a couple incredibly large legacy players that, because there's reputational risk, because there are concerns that they need to tackle, they can be somewhat slow moving sometimes. And again, sometimes they have a really good reason for that, but it's still, people want to innovate and people want to go somewhere with their new ideas. And so we're seeing a lot of that migrate into the Web3 space. I think we're seeing a lot of that because one of the things that I think Web3 does incredibly well is it allows for specialization in the sense that in a lot of legacy industries, you had huge incentives for like vertical integration. So if like we think of banks, for example, you would take deposits, they would issue loans, they would have investment arms, and you just had this like full stack, this huge suite of services. But blockchains can be so interconnected, they can be so composable, you can have better specialization. And we're kind of starting to see that in the carbon space, where you're having auditors that are separate from the standards bodies, that are separate from the registries, that are separate from the exchanges. So everyone can kind of be experimenting together and you can hit that critical mass more quickly.
I think we should kind of dive in carbon credits a bit more. And the reason why is because I think the phrase and the term and the idea of carbon credits is generally known, but I don't think the nuance of the problem is well known. And I would love if you could kind of give us the context for what is the problem, like what was like the initial reason for carbon credits, what does like the landscape look like, and then what is that nuance that blockchain has that really unlocks the value proposition that existed that whole time.
Yeah. So to unpack that, the first thing I think we want to do is recognize that generally speaking, we're oftentimes talking about like three different types of credits or three assets. And oftentimes in conversation, we'll muddle them all together because the genesis or the motivation behind each of them, a little bit different, but obviously all related to the climate crisis. First, we have renewable energy credits or RECs. Those are probably the most simple in that you can have a REC if your energy production or consumption, just somewhere along that value chain, is coming from a renewable source. The motivation for that is you can't track individual electrons just because they're floating around in the grid. So if I want to make an investment into renewable energy, if I want to make sure that I'm paying for renewable energy, well, I might not be able to trace the electrons, but I can trace these certificates around. So they kind of move in parallel. And it's just, your way as a consumer or, a buyer of energy to show, to demonstrate, to make an investment in renewable energy. On the actual pure carbon side, there's an important distinction as well that exists between carbon removal and credits that are associated with actually stripping a ton of carbon out of the atmosphere and storing it, in a chemical process or in trees or in the ground, actually stripping carbon out. And the other type of credit that is a or an emissions avoidance credit or carbon avoidance credit. Whereas I'm not pulling a ton of actual carbon out of the atmosphere, but I am avoiding a ton of carbon. So I'm like, the carbon I'm removing from the atmosphere is counterfactual carbon or hypothetical carbon. And there are credits attached to all three of these, and there are therefore like different prices that get ascribed to them. One of the reasons that, I think there's a great marriage between blockchain and carbon is in all of my experience, there are only like two communities, two groups of people that talk about this double spending problem or this digital scarcity problem. For anyone not familiar with it, double spending, just the idea that if I have $20 in my pocket, I can only give that $20 to two people. But if we're doing everything on a computer, well, I can just, copy paste a picture of that $20 bill and I could give it to two different people, therefore making something out of nothing. Bitcoin and the original blockchain work was meant to solve that digital double spending problem. And the double spending problem is pretty common actually in the carbon space, where you'll have some credits that get minted, they get registered, and then they're actually sold two times or multiple times. And well, because obviously, yes, I'm taking physical delivery, or I can touch and feel the piece of paper, I can't touch the carbon. So while you can't, double spend a ton of corn, because eventually I'll expect the shipment to arrive, I don't actually know if I was the only one that received that carbon, because I'm not getting anything physical. So there's just, again, a good alignment, because those are really the only two communities that are focused on that problem. I'd say that's one area. The other area just goes to the fact that there isn't a lot of transparency in these markets. There's not a lot of trust in these markets. And if people are going to care, if people are going to believe that these sorts of markets and systems can actually solve that problem, they need to be able to understand them. They need to be able to trust them. And so that idea of reaching out, being more inclusive in these markets and infrastructures that we're building, I think makes blockchain a good fit here as well.
The market is global. And what rails does the global market participate on? One of the largest problems is that we just don't know how to quantify the cost of our fuels, or we don't know how to quantify the cost of our pollution, I guess I should say.
Yeah.
And carbon credits are helping us in a way quantify those pollutant costs so that we can accurately price it in the capitalist system.
Exactly, and I think we find ourselves struggling with this a lot, obviously because of the ethical focus, or kind of some of the circles that we run in. There's like been this unfortunate blending of the word capitalist or capitalism with just like markets, and that, like, yes, markets are a part of capitalism, and capitalism is kind of like one part of markets, but they're not the same. And so like you can have this more kind of public goods thinking, or you can have like all different systems of governance, all different like economic models, and still have markets. Because at the end of the day, markets are like, they're an information source. They are a way that we can evaluate things on a relative basis, measure things, et cetera, et cetera. So we don't, criticism of like, late stage capitalism or whatever we're in right now does not and should not also be criticism of markets. Because again, markets are just like the source of the information that we need to plan, to make decisions, to do any of that.
I love the view of markets as information systems. I think really unlocks the way that it should be viewed. And then if you have a protocol for delivering information and value on the same rails, or maybe not the same exact rails, but in the same native way, it gives you the opportunity to do all these other things that weren't built into the legacy system over the past 100 years. And so now let's distribute it and push creativity to the edges and see what comes on.
Very well said.
As we're coming into the end of the hour and wrapping up, the other quote that came from one of your interviews that stuck with me is, I think it was from Marcus Aurelius: "You can commit injustice by doing nothing." And so I wanted to ask, what does that quote mean to you?
So I'd say that quote means a number of things to me. It definitely is pretty central to the motivation that I had to kind of become a social entrepreneur in the first place. In that, I saw the way the world was, and I saw like how, as I was coming out of university, the most in-demand jobs and the craziest recruiting processes were like for consulting and for banking and for like very large established like tech companies, that I was so concerned and kind of disheartened by the fact that felt like where our best talent was going. That our best talent coming out of these universities was going to collect advisory fees on mergers or on IPOs. And yes, I fully understand there's a relationship between the quality of financial services and the cost of capital, et cetera. There's this whole nice little trickle down thing. but the efficiency on that is not necessarily great. And so in a lot of ways, that quote and that line of thinking is, what brought me to topple in this sort of, social good experimentation. But I think also more specifically, it's actually informed a lot of like our early supply chain work as well, in that as consumers, the things that we are buying when we buy chocolates or coffee, hey, we've got Valentine's Day coming up. So a lot of people are buying flowers, chocolates, things like that. We don't know where those are coming from. And if we're not careful, we can be contributing to, forced labor conditions, child labor, environmental degradation halfway around the world, just because we bought a box of chocolates or bought a bouquet of roses. And if we're not asking these questions, we are kind of really at risk for that. So that's, where a lot of my thinking around that quote comes from.
Love that. You mentioned refi during our talk here, and I was just wondering if you could just explain that out. What is refi? Can you define that for us?
Yeah, so refi is, play on DeFi, DeFi being decentralized finance, a lot of those, market and DEX and like those financial applications that we see people playing with in the blockchain Web3 space. Refi is a play on that again as regenerative finance. So efforts to take financial experimentation, market experimentation, and apply it to carbon markets, or to apply it to investing into biodiversity, or investing into more like sustainable methods of agriculture. So it's that sort of financial innovation, financial development with an environmental focus, or an environmental co-benefit, shall we say.
As opposed to being strictly consumption, how do you participate in a system that is is regenerative, is sustainable?
The choices that we make, we still need to buy things, we still need to invest in things, but just kind of changing the where or the what, where our money is going, we can make a big difference.
Awesome. Chris, we covered a wide range of things today, from philosophy to the carbon credit markets. Is there anything else that you want to add or point people to in terms of Topple or yourself? Please feel free.
I think what I'll kind of leave this on is, obviously beginning of 2023, the price in the cryptocurrency space looks very different than it did this time last year. But I guess I want to make this as a reminder to everyone that people are still building, the innovation is still happening. And, I've seen, I don't know, this is probably my fourth or fifth market crash I've gone through in the space. And the most exciting ideas always seem to happen right after those crashes. So if you've got one of those exciting ideas, I definitely encourage you to, is a great time to jump into the space and start experimenting.
Great sentiment. Chris, we're lucky to have you. So is the rest of the ecosystems. Thanks for coming on our show today.
Thanks for having me, Steph. A lot of fun today.